Welcome. Today, Chuck and Brock take time to try to balance the age-old battle between Parmenides and Heraclitus, between the permanent and unchanging aspects of reality, and the ever-changing flow and flux of it.
It's a good evening, my friend, and the chance to talk about interesting things together just is very exciting. And so I want to thank you, as always, for talking with me. We get to engage a lot of time around structured material. We've read Herman Bavinck's Reformed Ethics, Volume 1 together. We've read Cambridge History of Philosophy in the 19th Century together. We're reading the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy together, and I'm loving it. But as much as I love the structured discussions, I love the chance to just talk about less structured, let's say, because it's not that we necessarily come in cold with topics like this, but definitely it's not as structured as the other times when we're talking and we have an actual text to refer to. But I just am excited to follow up on last week's discussion. We had this idea that we talked about the defining characteristics of Christianity, and maybe let's just say a challenge of modernity, if not the challenge. Maybe we can put it in such a hyperbolic statement. Maybe modernity really contrasts with Christianity in this way. And when I say modernity, I mean, of course, the secular part of it. And we had a good chance to talk about how to use a pre-Socratic metaphor for better or for worse. It seemed like the Via Antiqua, as it's sometimes been called the ancient way, has majored or emphasized in the Parmenidean side of things. So Parmenides was the Greek philosopher who said that all is one, and that really dovetails nicely into some discussion, some theological idea of the permanence of God and God's universal decree, his universal and unchanging decree. We could say that projects very closely, maps very closely to this Parmenidean ideal of permanence, of immutability, of never change. And the via moderna, this modern way, this way of looking at things in a liberal or progressive fashion. And there, perhaps the opposing pre-Socratic philosopher might be Heraclitus. And so Heraclitus, as we've talked about, Chuck, is the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher of impermanence, of eternal flux, of everything is changing and nothing is stationary, nothing is permanent. You never step into the same river twice, is the famous saying attributed to him. And perhaps that's overstating, because I certainly would imagine that there are some moderns and some postmoderns who, even if they reject the grand narratives of the Western Christian tradition, still might feel that there are things that are permanent and immutable, if not at a religious level. But by and large, we talked about how the ideas of modernity have attacked the established order. And we referenced Zygmunt Bauman's thesis in his Liquid Modernity book last time, and basically how his thesis really summed up or stated in a very succinct fashion the contrast and maybe the conflict between Christianity and secularizing modern movements. And so that's where we left off last week. I wanted to make a move. I wanted to pivot. I wanted to go in a new direction, but I opened the door to charges of possibly becoming like a modernist in doing so. And I wanted to address that because I don't think that's a mistake that I make, or that perhaps you've made in the ways we've talked about characterizing Christianity. But that's just a high level, and that's maybe what we can get into tonight and talk about a little bit more, if that sounds good on your end. What are some initial thoughts for this discussion, Chuck, as it relates to what we were talking about last week?
Yeah, the interesting thing to me that I spent some time thinking about after we talked last week is just this idea of liquidity and where it might be useful and where it might not, right? And so we've actually had some discussions on other topics as well, where, for example, just yesterday we were talking about skepticism in light of the history of medieval philosophy. And we had talked around the idea that there's a sense in which full-on skepticism, where one takes on skepticism at the very base of what they believe, is antithetical to Christianity, and perhaps so irrational as to make it such that even those who claim to hold to such a view really don't. But we also talked about how one can use particular question or particular skeptical question as a way of trying to get answers to things and trying a way to shift some of the paradigms that we often think in a positive way. And I wonder whether this concept of liquidity is somewhat similar in that if one holds at the very core, as there are people in modernity who do, that there is nothing that everything potentially is changing, that even time potentially changes and doesn't necessarily proceed in a particular single direction. And it is my understanding that even among cosmologists, there is a move in that direction among those who really focus on the idea of rather than a single Big Bang, perhaps followed by a final big crunch, but rather this idea of the cycle of endless Big Bangs and potentially a multiverse and multiple ways of things operating, that there has been this move to this very liquid, the rules can change at any time, there's nothing permanent, they just happen to be the way they are at this moment. And I think that is, again, contrary to Christian belief. Christian belief does revolve around certain immutable things, that God is the creator and that he has created creatures, that sin has entered into the world and has affected every single being, every single creature in the world, and most especially humans by separating us from God, but that there is a Redeemer and that Redeemer has acted to redeem us. And as a result, God's chosen people are saved and can look forward to restoration and reconciliation. And those are immutable, unchangeable, specific ideas, as is the idea of Scripture as God breathed and useful for teaching and preaching and instruction. Taking that as a whole, this idea of liquidity is problematic. But are there ways to use this concept in a far less comprehensive, in a way that sort of uses liquid type arguments in limited contexts to try to discover things about the world? I will say that in thinking about this, I'm not quite sure, I couldn't come up with any really good examples of where this has been useful necessarily, but I can imagine it to be so. But then what does that mean? And how do we deal with the difference? We don't want to create sort of a slippery slope from using a particular kind of argument to that particular kind of argument becoming the be all and end all. We don't want to do that. And so we do have to have some care in how we use it. And we have to think about how we use these sort of liquid type arguments to the point where it's probably fair to say that if we haven't thought through how we use them, haven't created sort of a set of boundaries and a set of principles for how we use them, perhaps they may be of less use and of more concern to us if we just use them willy-nilly. But it's one of the things as after I thought about some of our discussion, that's one area that I've been thinking about. Now, I don't know if that's kind of where you're headed today, but at least was something that I've been thinking about.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. I think you've summarized it really well. There are challenges on several dimensions. And so there are multiple ways in which we can think about the issues of permanence and change. And it seems that it's very hard to think of a philosophical system as being complete without having some commitments around some aspect of a changeable reality, as well as some aspects of a permanent or an immutable portion of reality. And so it's a bit not fair to just make all of modernity completely liquid so as to defy any states of solidity. But let's go back to Bauman here to consider what he has to say about it. So in his preface, he says, and this is the most important commitment here that I think affects the particular structure of what I believe to be a secular, human-centered or humanistic form of liquid modernity. And so he says, what was some time ago dubbed as post-modernity, and what I've chosen to call more to the point liquid modernity, is the growing conviction that change is the only permanent and uncertainty the only certainty. 100 years ago, to be modern meant chase the final state of perfection. Now it means an infinity of improvement with no final state in sight and none desired. And so this is the ultimate sort of postmodern rejection of narrative, of meaning that comes external to the human creature. And the typical example here is that think of Nietzsche's God is Dead movement. So how does Nietzsche's famous quote go? I'm only going to approximate it, I'm sure. Something like God is dead and we have killed him. And there the idea is that Nietzsche thinks that he has thrown God out of his reality. And henceforth, he himself will be internally generating his own values, his own meaning, what it means to live and to be a person and to interact, what is his own idea of right and wrong. If you ever have heard the statement, to thine own self be true, that seems to be good here. Now, Bauman is not necessarily rejecting any possible aspects of solidity, or let's maybe call it permanent, but it's a very impermanent permanence, if I can summarize him. And let me read further in the preface about what he's saying here. So he's just said now that this liquid modernity means an infinity of improvement with no final state in sight and none desired. Now, he continues on and says, flexibility has replaced solidarity as the ideal condition to be pursuit of things and affairs. All solids, including those that are momentarily desirable, are tolerated only in as far as they promise to remain easily and obediently fusible on demand. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that we can rewrite dictionaries and we can give words new meaning. And when we do that, the people who protest that the old meanings were just fine, well, we can dismiss them because we can be liquid to adapt a new meaning. But then if somebody wishes to do that same dialectic step on us, why, then we can be solid and we can insist that they use our lexicons and dictionaries and that they use our frame of discussion and engagement. And so I'm reminded of the joke from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. So very often in these movies, the plot devices include somebody trying to make a bargain or a deal or some sort of contract or compact with a pirate. And of course, Chuck, from watching those movies or just knowing about how pirates were regarded as being people who were not committed to any specific code, there was a running joke in the movie that said, keep to the code, more like guideline. And so basically in those movies, the pirates would honor the code when it was to their advantage, and they would change the terms of the code when it suited them. And I think right away, we have to ask how his liquid modernity differs from this. If he's generating meaning, if he's generating value, and there's no final state in sight, and there's no desired ending state or ultimate commitment, then how can we engage with him with any sort of good faith? You know, what makes him different from trying to do business with one of the pirates from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies? I think that's the first question. And then we'll get into some of the other issues that I was talking about that I wanted to follow up from last week. But this part here about the narrative structure being flexible, soft, and liquid when desired, and then all of a sudden it can be solid and inflexible when desired as well, provided that it can then be made impermanent again for a future dialectic pivot. And so, what do you think, Chuck, trying to swim in those waters is? Do you want to have that kind of business partner when you're drawing up the terms for your business partnership?